Ladies and gentlemen, what would you do if you were treated like less than a human, unaware that everyone around you believed you were nothing more than an ordinary traveler? Today, we share with you the shocking story of a wealthy airline owner who decided to experience his own service incognito, only to uncover a deeply hidden truth that would change everything. Picture this: a successful businessman books an economy ticket for a routine flight, wanting to experience firsthand what his passengers might endure. But instead of a smooth journey, what awaited him was disrespect, aggression, and shocking treatment from his own employees. This story is one that speaks of humility, courage, and accountability, a journey of unexpected discovery that will leave you stunned. As the plane doors closed and the flight attendants began their routine, there was a sense of tension that settled in the cabin. Our protagonist, dressed casually to avoid drawing attention, found himself in a position he had never expected, judged, dismissed, and ultimately humiliated by those who should have been offering comfort and care. The experience began as an ordinary flight, but soon spiraled into a shocking sequence of events that unveiled the true nature of customer service his company was providing. It's a story of hidden identities, revealing truths, and bringing justice to light. The businessman faced the sort of disdain and mistreatment that no passenger should ever experience, and through his journey, he uncovered the systemic issues buried within his own company. These were issues that could only be discovered by stepping into the shoes of an average traveler, by stripping away the title, the wealth, and the prestige, and becoming just another face in the crowd. But this isn't just about one man's bad experience. It's about what he chose to do afterward, how he took what happened to him and used it as a catalyst for change, not just for himself, but for his entire airline. He took an experience that could have left him embittered and instead found the strength to seek justice, not only for himself, but for all the passengers who might have faced similar treatment without the power to do anything about it. So, join us as we unfold the incredible events of that flight and see what transpired as this airline owner faced off against prejudice and abuse, only to rise up and deliver justice. It's a tale that will make you question the nature of power and humility, a reminder that even those at the top must be held accountable for the actions of their businesses. Remember to leave a comment below with your thoughts on what you would have done in his shoes, and don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Isaac Marshall, CEO of Airstar Airlines, wasn't a man to rest on his laurels. With a deep belief in quality and respect, Isaac decided one day that he needed to see his airline from the perspective of a regular passenger. He wanted to make sure that every customer, regardless of class or status, was treated well. So, Isaac purchased an economy ticket without revealing his identity. Dressed in simple clothing, Isaac blended in with the other travelers. He was excited to see his company in action from the back of the plane. Yet, as he stood in line, he noticed a few side glances. The check-in agent seemed confused when she looked at him, almost as if he didn't belong. He simply smiled, nodding politely. As Isaac moved through security, he could feel the suspicious eyes of the staff. It wasn't new to him; he knew he didn't fit the typical image of an economy-class traveler. His neatly trimmed beard, the confident stride, and an aura of authority, though muted by his choice of clothing, still seemed to draw attention. Nevertheless, he passed through without incident, determined not to let the subtle judgment affect his experience. Arriving at the gate, Isaac found a seat and watched the crowd around him. People were busy with their phones, chatting with family, or simply waiting. The boarding call was announced, and people began to gather near the gate. He joined the line, sensing a slight unease from those around him. There was a momentary hesitation from the gate agent as she scanned his boarding pass, her eyebrows raising slightly before she handed it back without a word. Isaac shrugged it off, knowing he had to take everything in stride if he wanted the most genuine experience. Once aboard the plane, Isaac made his way through the narrow aisle to his assigned seat in the middle of the economy section. He appreciated the hum of conversations, the rustle of bags being stowed in the overhead compartments, and the unmistakable buzz that filled the cabin before takeoff. As he settled into his seat, he took a deep breath. This was it, his chance to understand what his passengers went through. Not long after, a flight attendant named Carla came down the aisle. She was checking tickets and helping passengers with their luggage. When she reached Isaac's row, her expression changed. Instead of the friendly smile she had given the passengers before him, her face hardened. She looked at him as though he were out of place, her eyes narrowing. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Carla asked, her voice carrying a hint of skepticism. Isaac nodded and showed her his ticket, offering a calm smile. He could tell that she wasn't expecting someone like him to be sitting there. Carla scrutinized the ticket for a moment longer than necessary, then reluctantly nodded and moved on, muttering something under her breath. Isaac couldn't make out the words, but he could feel the tension in the air. He watched her move on, noticing the difference in how she treated the other passengers compared to him. The plane slowly filled, and the crew began preparing for takeoff. Isaac continued to observe, noting how Carla's demeanor seemed to shift depending on who she was addressing. When speaking with a well-dressed man a few rows ahead, her voice was bright and cheerful. But when she passed Isaac again, her expression hardened, and she barely acknowledged his presence. It was subtle, but the distinction was clear. She had already made assumptions about him, and those assumptions dictated her behavior. As the plane taxied down the runway, Isaac leaned back and tried to relax. He had hoped for a seamless experience, one that would reaffirm his belief in the quality of his airline service. Instead, he was beginning to see cracks in the facade. He wanted to believe it was just one flight attendant having a bad day, but a nagging feeling in his gut told him otherwise. He had always prided himself on Airstar's customer service, and seeing this firsthand was both disappointing and eye-opening. The flight took off smoothly, and the cabin crew began their routine. Carla came down the aisle with the beverage cart. Isaac watched as she handed out drinks, her demeanor warm and friendly, until she reached his row. When Isaac requested a glass of water, Carla barely looked at him. "We'll get to you when we can," she said curtly before moving on without another word. Isaac blinked, taken aback by the abruptness of her response. He glanced around, noticing the puzzled expressions of the passengers seated near him. They had seen how Carla treated him, and some exchanged uneasy glances. Isaac took a deep breath, deciding to let it slide for now. He wanted to see how the rest of the flight played out before drawing any conclusions. Time passed, and Carla returned with the beverage cart. She served the passengers beside Isaac with a smile, but when she reached him, her expression soured. She handed him a cup of water without a word, her eyes avoiding his. Isaac accepted it, his face impassive. He could feel the judgment in her actions, a sense that she believed he didn't belong, that he was somehow less deserving of her courtesy. Isaac knew he couldn't let this go unnoticed. He was here to understand the real experiences of his customers, and what he was seeing was unacceptable. The treatment he was receiving wasn't just about him, it was about anyone who might not fit the preconceived notions of the crew. He knew he had to stay calm, to keep observing, and to take note of every detail. As the flight continued, Isaac's resolve only grew stronger. He saw the small ways in which passengers were treated differently, the extra care given to those who looked affluent, the dismissive tones used with those who didn't. He realized that this wasn't just about one flight attendant or one flight. It was a systemic issue, one that needed to be addressed from the top down. Isaac leaned back in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he watched Carla interact with the other passengers. He knew that by the end of this journey, he would have a lot to say, and a lot to change. This flight was meant to be an opportunity for him to learn, and learn he would, even if the lessons were harsher than he had anticipated. The flight had barely begun when Isaac noticed the difference in treatment. As Carla moved through the aisle serving passengers, her demeanor towards Isaac was entirely different. While other travelers received warm smiles and generous portions, Isaac was met with indifference. She was attentive to others, helping them store bags, offering pillows, and answering questions with a kind voice. But when she approached Isaac, it was as if a cold wall had come down. Isaac tried not to let it bother him. He was here to observe, to learn about the experiences of a regular passenger on his airline. But it was hard not to feel the sting of Carla's indifference. He watched as she gave a young woman 2 cups of juice with a bright smile and then moved to the next row, where she chatted briefly with a middle-aged man, laughing at his joke. When she finally reached Isaac's row, her face darkened, and her smile disappeared. Can I get a glass of water, please? Isaac asked politely, his voice even. Carla frowned, her eyes narrowing as she looked down at him. We'll get to you when we can, she snapped, her tone dismissive as she turned and continued to serve those around him. Isaac blinked, slightly taken aback. He tried to rationalize it as stress, perhaps she was having a bad day. It wasn't easy being a flight attendant, and he understood that. Still, the stark contrast between how she treated him and the other passengers was hard to ignore. Isaac took a deep breath, deciding to be patient. He reminded himself that he was here to see things for what they were, not to react emotionally. He continued to observe, noting how Carla's attitude shifted based on the passenger she was dealing with. An elderly couple received extra blankets, and a mother traveling with her child was given special attention to make them comfortable. Isaac was glad to see those positive interactions. It meant that good service was possible. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something about him had caused Carla to decide he wasn't deserving of that same courtesy. Later in the flight, Carla returned to his row, this time with the beverage cart. Isaac watched as she served the passengers around him, her demeanor pleasant and attentive. She handed drinks to the woman beside him with a smile, then turned to Isaac. Her expression changed again, the friendliness replaced by a look of clear disdain. Coffee, she asked, her voice flat, as if she were doing him a great favor. Isaac nodded. Yes, please. Carla poured the coffee, her movements deliberate. As she handed the cup to Isaac, she seemed to hesitate for just a moment, long enough for Isaac to notice the look in her eyes, before tilting her hand ever so slightly. The hot coffee spilled directly onto his lap, the scalding liquid soaking through his pants almost instantly. Isaac gasped, biting back a cry as he scrambled to wipe the coffee away, the heat searing his skin. Carla didn't flinch. Instead of apologizing, she sneered, her lips curling in a faint, almost satisfied smile. You should be more careful, she muttered, her tone dripping with condescension, before turning away without so much as a backward glance. Isaac sat there, stunned. The pain from the hot coffee was sharp, but the shock of Carla's blatant disregard cut even deeper. He looked around, noticing that a few passengers had seen what happened. Some watched with sympathy, while others quickly looked away, unwilling to get involved. Isaac clenched his jaw, holding his anger in check. He was there to observe, after all. He needed to see the truth, no matter how uncomfortable or humiliating it became. He reached for a napkin, trying to clean himself up as best as he could. The burn on his thigh throbbed, a painful reminder of Carla's actions. Isaac knew he couldn't let this slide, but he also knew that now wasn't the time to reveal who he was. He needed to see how far this mistreatment would go, how deep the issue ran within his airline service culture. The flight continued, and Isaac tried to focus on his surroundings. He noticed the way other flight attendants interacted with passengers. Most of them were professional, courteous, and attentive. But Carla's behavior stood out, her disdain toward him almost palpable. She passed by his seat multiple times, each time ignoring him completely. When she served meals, she skipped over him without even asking if he wanted anything. Isaac watched as she served the passengers in front of him and behind him, her attitude shifting to accommodate each of them. She laughed at a joke one man made, offered an extra snack to a young boy, and even helped an older woman open her meal. But when she reached Isaac's row, she moved past him as if he didn't exist. He pressed the call button, hoping to speak with another flight attendant, but Carla was the one who responded. She approached with an expression that clearly showed her annoyance. "What do you need?" she asked, her tone sharp. "Could I get a meal, please?" Isaac asked, keeping his voice calm despite his frustration. Carla sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes. "We're all out," she said curtly, before turning on her heel and walking away without another word. Isaac knew she was lying. He had just watched her serve meals to the passengers around him. His stomach growled in protest, but he ignored it, focusing instead on the bigger picture. Isaac leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. He had built Airstar Airlines with the belief that every passenger deserved respect and quality service, regardless of their status. What he was experiencing now was the exact opposite of those values. It was disheartening, but it was also motivating. He knew that changes needed to be made, and he was determined to make them. The rest of the flight passed in much the same way. Carla continued to ignore Isaac, her disdain for him evident in every interaction, or lack thereof. When the plane hit turbulence, she checked on the passengers nearby, offering reassurance and even holding the hand of a nervous flyer. But when Isaac tried to ask her a question, she brushed him off, her eyes cold and dismissive. By the time the plane began its descent, Isaac had seen enough. He had witnessed firsthand the kind of treatment that some of his passengers might be subjected to, treatment that was unacceptable by any standard. He knew that once this flight was over, he would have to take immediate action. Not just with Carla, but with the entire culture that allowed someone like her to feel justified in treating a passenger this way. As the plane touched down and the passengers began gathering their belongings, Isaac remained seated, watching Carla as she moved through the cabin. She was smiling again, her demeanor bright and cheerful as she helped other passengers. It was as if the person who had spilled hot coffee on him and sneered at his discomfort had never existed. But Isaac knew better. He had seen the truth, and now it was time to do something about it. With a deep breath, Isaac stood, ready to face whatever came next. This was just the beginning of what would be a long journey, a journey to ensure that every passenger on his airline was treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. And he was ready to take that journey, no matter how difficult it might be. As the flight continued, Isaac realized that Carla wasn't the only member of the crew treating him this way. Mark, another flight attendant, began making his rounds, distributing meals to the passengers. Isaac watched as Mark served each person, taking care to make sure they had everything they needed. He approached Isaac's row, and Isaac seized the opportunity, trying to ask for a meal. "Excuse me, could I get a meal, please?" Isaac asked, his voice calm and polite. Mark didn't even bother to look at him. He walked right past Isaac, his gaze fixed ahead as if Isaac were invisible. Isaac's stomach growled audibly, and he tried again, calling out to Mark. "Sir, I'd appreciate it if you could bring me a meal." This time, Mark stopped. He turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge Isaac's presence, but there was no warmth in his eyes. His lips twisted into a faint sneer. "We're out of meals for you," he said, his tone flat and dismissive. Then he continued down the aisle, not giving Isaac another glance. Isaac watched as Mark handed trays to the passengers a few rows behind him, his expression friendly and professional. Isaac knew the truth, there were still meals available, just not for him. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain composed. He needed to see how deep this behavior ran among the crew. It wasn't just about Carla anymore, there was a pattern, and he needed to understand its full extent. Minutes later, Carla returned, carrying a glass of water. Isaac noticed her smirk as she approached. She stopped at his row, her eyes locking onto his with a glint of malice. Without warning, she tilted her hand, spilling the water onto his lap. The cold liquid soaked through his pants, and Isaac felt the chill spread across his thighs. "Careful not to make a mess," Carla said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. The words hung in the air, heavy with disdain. She didn't offer an apology or a napkin, just that mocking smirk before she moved on. The humiliation was palpable, and Isaac could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him. Some looked away quickly, clearly uncomfortable with what they had just witnessed. Others glanced at him with pity, their expressions showing they understood the injustice of what was happening but felt powerless to intervene. Isaac took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he wiped at his lap with a napkin he had grabbed earlier. The cold water was nothing compared to the icy hostility radiating from the crew. He looked around the cabin, seeing the passengers who had received warm treatment, their needs attended to without hesitation. He compared it to the dismissive way he was being treated, as if he were an inconvenience, something less than human. He had spent years building Airstar Airlines, emphasizing respect, quality, and integrity. He had believed in a standard of service that treated everyone equally, that respected every passenger regardless of their background. But today, sitting in a wet seat, with the sting of cold water and disdainful remarks still fresh, he realized that something had gone horribly wrong within his company. The rest of the crew avoided eye contact with him, as if they knew, or perhaps had heard from Carla and Mark, that Isaac wasn't to be treated like the others. Isaac could sense it, the deliberate way they turned their backs when he raised his hand, the careful avoidance of his row whenever they made their rounds. It was more than just indifference, it was as if they had made an unspoken agreement to ignore him. Isaac's frustration grew, but he kept it in check. He had to stay calm, had to observe everything. He needed to understand the depth of the problem if he was going to fix it. The issue wasn't just a few rude employees, it was a culture that allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked. It was systemic, and that made it all the more troubling. As the flight dragged on, Isaac remained in his seat, the discomfort from his soaked clothes fading as his determination grew. He thought about the countless passengers who might have experienced similar mistreatment without the power to do anything about it. People who weren't the CEO of the airline, who couldn't bring about change simply because they held the authority to do so. He thought of them, and he knew that his mission had shifted. He was no longer just here to observe, he was here to ensure that no one else would ever be treated like this again. The flight eventually began its descent, and Carla once again walked through the cabin, checking seat belts and preparing passengers for landing. When she reached Isaac's row, she didn't even glance at him. Instead, she moved quickly past, her demeanor cheerful as she interacted with the passengers beside him. Isaac watched her, his face impassive, but inside, his resolve was solidifying. This was more than just an uncomfortable flight, this was a turning point. He had witnessed the flaws in his company's service firsthand, and now he had the responsibility to address them. He knew what he had to do, and he knew it wouldn't be easy. But Isaac Marshall wasn't one to back down from a challenge. As the plane touched down and the passengers began gathering their belongings, Isaac remained seated for a moment, taking it all in. The smiles, the laughter, the goodbyes exchanged between the crew and the passengers they favored, all of it contrasted sharply with the treatment he had received. He stood slowly, his expression calm, but his mind was already racing with plans for what needed to be done. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Things escalated as the plane began its descent. Isaac tried to stand, wanting to gather his belongings and prepare to disembark like everyone else. But as he stood, Carla was there, blocking his path with an icy glare. "Sit down," she commanded, her voice sharp and unfeeling. The expression on her face left no room for argument, her eyes narrowed in a way that suggested she believed Isaac was deliberately causing trouble. Isaac took a deep breath, keeping his frustration in check. "The plane is landing. I need to get my things," he said evenly, trying to remain calm. Carla didn't budge. Instead, she leaned in closer, her eyes locked onto his, and her voice dropped to a cold whisper. "I said, sit down. Now." Before Isaac could respond, the pilot, Jackson, emerged from the cockpit. Isaac glanced at him, expecting some level of professionalism, but Jackson's eyes held the same disdain that Carla's did. With a brief nod from Carla, Jackson moved toward Isaac, his expression one of irritation. "Is there a problem here?" Jackson asked, his tone suggesting that whatever the problem was, it had to be Isaac's fault. "I'm just trying to get my bag," Isaac replied, his voice remaining steady, though inside, the absurdity of the situation was beginning to overwhelm him. Here he was, the owner of Airstar Airlines, being treated worse than any passenger should ever be treated. Jackson, however, wasn't interested in hearing Isaac's explanation. He exchanged a glance with Carla, and without another word, the two of them grabbed Isaac by the arms and forced him back into his seat. The force of their grip was startling, and Isaac found himself shoved down, the armrest digging painfully into his side. "Stay put," Jackson growled, his face inches from Isaac's, the anger in his voice barely concealed. Isaac felt the snap of cold metal as Jackson produced a set of handcuffs, securing Isaac's wrists to the armrest. The cuffs were tight, almost painfully so, and Isaac could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The absurdity and humiliation of it all made his head spin. The cuffs were not just a physical restraint, they were a symbolic stripping of his dignity, a way for the crew to assert their power over him. Isaac sat there, bound and forced into submission, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He could hear Carla and Jackson muttering to each other, their voices dripping with derision. Mark soon joined them, adding his own sneering comments. They spoke about Isaac as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience, an unruly passenger who needed to be put in his place. Isaac closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his breathing. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him. Some were filled with shock, others with confusion, and a few with pity. No one said anything. The silence in the cabin was heavy, broken only by the hushed voices of the crew and the occasional bump of turbulence as the plane descended. It was in that moment, handcuffed to his seat, humiliated and degraded, that Isaac realized how deeply ingrained this hostility was within his crew. This wasn't just about Carla or Mark or even Jackson. This was a culture that had taken root in his airline, a culture of disrespect, prejudice, and abuse of power. And it was a culture that he had to change. Isaac had spent his career building Airstar Airlines from the ground up, instilling what he believed to be values of respect and equality into every aspect of the company. But now, he could see just how far those values had been eroded. The people he had trusted to represent his airline were doing the exact opposite of what he stood for. The plane finally touched down, the wheels hitting the tarmac with a jolt that shook Isaac out of his thoughts. The reality of his situation settled over him like a heavy weight. He looked down at the cuffs on his wrists, the cold metal biting into his skin, and he knew that things could not continue this way. Change had to happen, and it had to happen now. As the plane rolled to a stop, Carla and Jackson exchanged smug looks, clearly satisfied with how they had handled the situation. Isaac kept his eyes forward, his expression unreadable, but inside, his resolve was growing stronger. This was it, the breaking point. He had seen enough, experienced enough, and now it was time to take action. Whatever it took, Isaac would make sure that Airstar Airlines became what he had always envisioned it to be, an airline where every passenger, regardless of who they were or where they came from, was treated with dignity and respect. And that change would start with the very people who had tried to strip him of his own. When the flight finally landed, Isaac was escorted off the plane by 2 airport security officers. The cold metal of the handcuffs still stung against his wrists, but Isaac kept his composure. He walked with his head held high, his expression calm and resolute. The humiliation was undeniable, but Isaac knew that this moment was about something much bigger than his own dignity. The time had come for the truth to be revealed, and he was ready to make it happen. As they entered the terminal, the officers guided Isaac to a small seating area. He turned to them, his voice steady. "I need to speak to your superior," he said. The officers exchanged a brief glance, then one of them nodded and stepped away to make a call. Isaac remained seated, his hands resting in his lap, his eyes scanning the busy terminal. He saw people moving about, families reuniting, business travelers on their phones, airline staff attending to passengers. It all felt surreal after what he had experienced on the flight. After a few moments, the officer returned. "Follow me," he said, his voice slightly more respectful now. Isaac stood, and they walked down a long corridor to the airline's administrative office. The door opened, and Isaac was led inside, where a man in a suit sat behind a desk, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of Isaac in handcuffs. "This is Mr. Thomas Avery, our operations manager," the officer said. Avery looked up, his expression one of confusion mixed with concern. Isaac met Avery's gaze and spoke calmly. "Thank you, officer. That will be all for now." The officers hesitated for a moment, then nodded and left the room, closing the door behind them. Avery stood, his brow furrowed. "What is going on here?" "Who are you?" he asked, clearly trying to make sense of the situation. Isaac took a deep breath. "My name is Isaac Marshall. I am the CEO and owner of Airstar Airlines." He watched as Avery's eyes went wide, his face paling visibly. The recognition was immediate, and the stunned look on Avery's face spoke volumes. "Mr. Marshall, I had no idea, Avery stammered, his voice faltering as he quickly came around the desk, his demeanor shifting to one of deference. Please, let me help you with those cuffs. Isaac held up his bound wrists, allowing Avery to fumble with the key until the handcuffs clicked open and fell away. Isaac rubbed his wrists, the skin red and tender from the tight metal. He looked directly at Avery, his eyes steady. I need you to understand the gravity of what just happened on that flight, he said, his voice calm but filled with authority. Avery swallowed hard, nodding. Of course, sir. Please, have a seat. Tell me everything. Isaac sat down, and for the next several minutes, he recounted every detail of the flight, Carla's scornful attitude, Mark's blatant refusal to serve him, the physical force used by Jackson, and the handcuffs that were slapped onto his wrists without cause. He described the humiliation, the hostility, and the complete lack of professionalism shown by the crew. Avery listened, his face growing more ashen with each passing moment. By the time Isaac finished speaking, Avery was visibly shaken. He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes wide with disbelief. Mr. Marshall, I can't begin to express how sorry I am. This is absolutely unacceptable. I assure you, this is not how we operate, Avery said, his voice trembling. Isaac leaned forward slightly, his gaze never wavering from Avery's. But it is how we operated today. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a culture that has been allowed to fester in my company, and it ends now. Avery nodded quickly, his face flushed. Yes, sir. Absolutely. I'll take immediate action. Effective immediately, I want every member of that crew removed from duty, Isaac said, his voice firm. I want this incident documented and a full investigation conducted. I need to know if this kind of behavior has happened before, and if so, how it went unnoticed. Avery scribbled notes as Isaac spoke, nodding vigorously. Of course, Mr. Marshall. I'll start the process right away. We will not tolerate this kind of behavior. I'll make sure those responsible are held accountable. Isaac sat back, taking a moment to let Avery's words sink in. He could see the weight of the situation settling on the operations manager, the realization that the very person they had humiliated and mistreated was the owner of the airline. There was no hiding from this, no covering it up. The truth was out, and it demanded action. One more thing, Mr. Avery, Isaac added, his tone softening slightly but still carrying an edge of authority. This isn't just about firing a few people. We need systemic change. I want a full review of our training programs, our service protocols, and the way we handle passenger relations. This behavior was a symptom of a larger problem, and we need to address the root cause. Avery nodded again, his face serious. I understand, sir. I'll make it my top priority. Isaac stood, and Avery quickly followed suit. I'll be overseeing this personally, Isaac said. And I expect regular updates. We have a responsibility to our passengers, to every person who chooses to fly with us, to ensure they are treated with dignity and respect. What happened today cannot happen again. Avery bowed his head slightly, a gesture of both respect and remorse. Yes, Mr. Marshall. You have my word. Isaac nodded, then turned to leave the office. As he walked out into the terminal, he felt a sense of determination solidify within him. This experience had been painful, humiliating, and eye-opening. But it had also given him clarity. The values he had built his company on had to be more than just words, they had to be lived, embodied by every single employee, from the ground crew to the flight attendants to the pilots. Isaac knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. Changing a company's culture was no small feat, but he was ready for it. He was ready to ensure that no passenger on an Airstar flight would ever endure what he had endured today. As he made his way through the terminal, people moved around him, oblivious to what had just transpired. Isaac took a deep breath. The real work was about to begin, and he would see it through, no matter what it took. In a conference room, Carla, Mark, and Jackson sat waiting, confusion evident on their faces. The silence was tense, and the uncertainty hung in the air like a thick fog. When the door finally opened and Isaac walked in, their expressions turned to shock. The realization of who stood before them drained the color from their faces. "I'm Isaac Marshall, the owner of Airstar," he said, his voice calm but filled with authority. He saw fear flash across Carla's eyes, and Mark looked down, suddenly unable to meet his gaze. Jackson shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his confidence visibly crumbling. "You treated me like I was less than human," Isaac continued, his tone unwavering. "You thought you could get away with this because you didn't know who I was. But that's the point, every person deserves respect, no matter their appearance or status." His words echoed in the room, carrying the weight of his conviction. Carla stammered an apology, her eyes welling up with tears as she began to realize the gravity of her actions. "Mr. Marshall, I'm so sorry. I didn't know," she managed, her voice cracking. Isaac held up his hand, cutting her off. "Apologies mean nothing now," he said, his expression stern. "Your actions have spoken far louder than your words ever could. You made choices to degrade, to humiliate, and to abuse the power entrusted to you. And now, you must face the consequences." With that, Isaac delivered his verdict. "You're all terminated, effective immediately. There will be no second chances. The cruelty and disdain you showed are unacceptable, and I won't tolerate such behavior in my company." His words were final, and the room fell into an uneasy silence. Isaac turned to leave, but paused at the door. "I am committed to rebuilding this airline from the ground up," he said, his voice softer but filled with determination. "Respect and integrity will be at the heart of every flight, for every passenger, regardless of who they are. This is my promise." As Isaac left the terminal that day, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was only the beginning, and he knew the journey ahead would be challenging. But he was ready. No passenger on Airstar would ever face what he had endured. Justice had been served, and a commitment to change had begun.